Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and thank you for joining us this panel. This is the second panel of our international conference, Great Power Competition, a Challenge to the Rule-Based Order. And this panel is titled Reinvigorating US-ASEAN Partnership in the Indo-Pacific. I'm glad to see you all here and very thankful to Ambassador Daniel Shields to chair this session. I would like to take the opportunity, and it's my honor to introduce Ambassador Daniel Shields, and then I will hand over it to the chair for the further proceedings. As a retired ambassador, Daniel Shields lectures, teaches courses, and conducts simulation relating to diplomacy and the Indo-Pacific region. From 2015 to 2018, he served as the diplomatic advisor to the commandant of the US Army War College, helping to educate future strategic leaders on how to integrate diplomatic information, military, economic, dime construct, and other instruments of power to achieve national security objective. In response to a request from the US Department of State, Ambassador served as the Charge d'Affaires of the US mission to ASEAN in Jakarta in 2017, traveling to Manila to support participation of the US President and Cabinet Secretaries in ASEAN-led related summits. He served as the US Ambassador to Brunei from 2011 to 2014, handling sensitive South China Sea-related issues in connection with Brunei's 2013 hosting of various summits involving the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In 2009 to 2010, he served as Charge d'Affaires of the US mission to Singapore, supporting the president's participation in APEC meetings. Ambassador's early to mid-career assignments were primarily in Japan and China, including a posting as political minister counselor at Embassy Beijing from 2004 to 2007 during the six-party talk regarding the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. He is fluent in Japanese and Chinese. Ambassador's first tour in the Foreign Service was as a vice consul at Embassy Manila from 1985 to 1987, where he observed and reported on the People Power Revolution and the fall of the Ferdinand Marcos regime. Ambassador holds an MS from the National War College at the National Defense University and BS from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Services. We are so good to see you and honored to have you, Ambassador Shields. Before handing over to the chair of this session, let me announce that the views expressed and presented here are personal, should not be construed to any organization and any institution. Over to you, Ambassador Shields.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Indu. Thank you to all the panelists, all the audience who have joined us. I know that many of you are up very early where you are, so I particularly appreciate that. With regard to our topic, I think it's extremely timely with regard to reinvigorating the US-ASEAN partnership in the Indo-Pacific. The reason that I think the timing is so good to have a discussion on this topic is that we're coming into the summit season in Southeast Asia and in ASEAN. And I know that many of you have seen the White House announcement on October 28th that President Biden will be in Phnom Penh from November 12th through 13th to participate in the annual US-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit. And my understanding, I don't speak for the US government anymore since I'm retired from the State Department, but my understanding is that he will reaffirm the US enduring commitment to Southeast Asia and ASEAN centrality. So this very much fits into our theme about efforts by the various parties involved to rejuvenate the US-ASEAN partnership. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do now is introduce the panelists. So what I will do is introduce each panelist, and then we will proceed, and each panelist will give his or her remarks. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Renato Cruz de Castro. He is a professor in the International Studies Department, De La Salle University, Manila. He is a chairholder of the Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in Philippine American Relations. He's been visiting fellow in the National Institute for Defense Studies, NIDS of the Japanese Ministry of Defense. He's also been invited by the Japan Institute of International Affairs as a visiting research fellow. He's spent time at the East-West Center in Washington as a US-ASEAN Fulbright Initiative researcher from the Philippines. He earned his PhD from the University of South Carolina as a Fulbright Scholar in 2001 and obtained his BA and 2 master's degrees from the University of the Philippines. So thank you very much, Renato, for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce the following speaker, who will be Koo Ying Hui. She is the head and senior lecturer in the Department of International and Strategic Studies at the University of Malaya. Her research lies at the intersection of human rights, democratization, and civil society actors, focusing on Southeast Asia, using the approach of international political sociology. She's the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters, as well as several books, including Marginalization and Human Rights in Southeast Asia, Rethinking Human Rights and Peace in Post-Independence East Timor Through Local Perspectives, and the Bersih Movement and Democratization in Malaysia. She is the editor-in-chief of the Malaysian Journal of International Relations. She sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs, Journal of Southeast Asian Human Rights, and the Indonesian Law Review. So thank you, Inhu. It's wonderful to have you with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Wafa Karisma. He is a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. He works on research topics including Indonesian foreign policy, the security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, and the geopolitics and foreign policy drivers around the Korean Peninsula, the humanitarian situation in Myanmar, and Indonesia's maritime security. So thank you, Wafa. Fantastic to have you with us. And then finally, as I mentioned to friends, I'm really excited that we have such a distinguished panel. We have Stephen Nagy, who has been the Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Japan since September 2014. Concurrently, he is a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a Research Fellow for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a Visiting Fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs, in addition to other positions. He was selected as Distinguished Fellow for the Asia-Pacific Foundation from 2017 to 2020, and he serves as Director of Policy Studies for the Yokosuka Council of Asia-Pacific Studies. Prior to returning to Tokyo, he was Assistant Professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong from 2009 to 2014. He obtained his PhD from Waseda University, Japan, in International Relations in 2008. So in a moment, those panelists whom I've just introduced will make their presentations. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to invite the audience to use the chat box at any time during the presentation to submit questions for the panelists. And if you'd like to direct them for a certain panelist, please let us know. In terms of the responses, we'll do the responses to the questions after each panelist has made his or her remarks. But go ahead anytime and put them in the chat box. There will be a prize of $25 each for the 2 best questions. I get to decide that. I'm very honored on that. So with no further ado or ceremonies or logistical announcements, let's turn it over to Renato Cruz de Castro as our first speaker. Renato.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for giving me the chance to express my view to a topic that I'm not really a specialist, because I'm not an Asianist guy. My area is primarily on the alliances, but nevertheless, this will be my 10 cents opinion regarding this very important topic. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll prepare it first.
Only 45 slides, Renato?
I'll be fast. You know me, I'm fast. Okay, I'm fast. Okay, I'll pass. Okay. So I'll address the first question that has been raised by Ambassador Daniel. What does the United States need to do to reinvigorate the alliance? You know, my approach is basically to say, just listen to us. Let's listen to ASEAN voice. And, you know, we are in, you know, we have, it's the right opportunity right now, primarily because my presentation will be based on an ASEAN-wide survey, you know, conducted by the Indonesian foreign policy community, and of course, generously funded by the Chinese representative in Jakarta, ASEAN. So let's hear to the voices of these ASEAN citizens, and from there, let's try to come out with some certain policy recommendation. So I was a discussant 3 days ago, invited by the foreign policy community in Indonesia to respond to its annual survey. I won't have to go to the details, okay? So the ASEAN-China Survey 2020 is the most addresses most pressing issues for Southeast Asians. What Southeast Asia thinks about China, you know, the elephant in the room, what about China, so forth and so on, several issues. So in a way, the survey attempts to capture Southeast Asian perspective of these issues related to China. So it has about 1,658 respondents from 10 Southeast Asian countries in 5 different categories: students, civil society, business community, academia. It's a really, if you have the chance, it had been publicly released 3 days ago. I can give you the website. You know, it's a well-funded research, primarily because it's well-funded, you know, and we have no one to fund it but the richest country here in the region. That's, of course, China. Okay, so but on the basis of this, let's listen to the voices, key issues. I only have 5. And on the basis of this, you know, what's been raised by these ASEAN citizens, I'm trying to, come out with ideas for American decision makers on what would be the policy approach. Okay, number 1 would be ASEAN-China economic cooperation. So 68% of respondents considered economic cooperation as very satisfactory. However, there's a caveat. Several of the respondents are wary of the externalities of their economic cooperation with China, namely defense issues, cybersecurity, environmental degradation, and transnational crimes. This is, of course, very apparent here in the Philippines, primarily because of the presence of Chinese online gaming operations here in the country. We can discuss it later. ASEAN public is concerned about the negative externality of ASEAN-China economic relations, and I mentioned it earlier. And something that's also emphasized in Cambodia, in Laos, and the Philippines, illegal migration and border control. There's a certain period here in the Philippines that we have about 350,000 Chinese working with, of course, tourist visa before the pandemic. Most ASEAN respondents are neutral, interestingly, on existing ASEAN economic cooperation. So this neutrality means certain degree wariness, or simply they don't care. Free trade agreement, regional economic partnership. So what are the policy recommendations? There's a need for the US to initiate a new economic partnership agreement. Unfortunately, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership never took off the ground because of the Trump administration. There's also, of course, an effort, but it has not gotten to the ground. We can discuss it later. In order to provide a regional grouping to consider economic diversification rather than economic dependence on China, leading, of course, to what the Chinese would euphemistically call a common destiny with ASEAN. So the US will need to, the support of Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan to ensure that ASEAN countries would realize the economic importance of economic diversification rather than shared economic destiny with China. You have several examples in the region of what would be the consequences of having a shared economic destiny with China. Just ask the Australians, just ask the South Koreans, and just ask the Filipinos in 2012. What will be the consequences? Washington and its allies should initiate efforts to address the negative externalities of ASEAN economic relations. And in a way, also, in the process, emphasize you have to be very wary of becoming totally economically dependent on China. Defense concerns, cybersecurity, environmental degradation, transnational crimes, illegal immigration, and of course, loose border control. Second, I'll try to be fast. ASEAN-China political and security cooperation. If economic cooperation is very satisfactory, This is, of course, the negative. We're going into the realm of wariness and, of course, negative attitude. Consistently, ASEAN respondents are not satisfied with political and security-related relations with China. This stems from, of course, the South China Sea dispute and the long delay in the negotiation of the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct for the parties in the South China Sea. Of the issue of trust, majority or 40% of respondents who decided, this is 42% of respondents decided not to answer the survey question. However, for those who answered the question whether you trust China or not, the majority answered that they are inclined not to trust China. So there's a great, it's also apparent here in the Philippines. The majority of the respondents, 71% who said that they do not trust China, stated that they distrust China because of political and economic and security reasons. Majority of respondents who answered that they do not trust China are, interestingly, from Thailand, Singapore. Vietnam is understandable. But I find what I found very interesting is in Thailand, that countries basically assume, especially in Washington, D.C., that Thailand has basically sold its soul to China. That's not the case. A large portion of the population in Thailand still do not distrust China. Now, going back to my recommendation, the U.S. must enhance its roles in Southeast Asia as the offshore strategic balancer, that countries in the region have to take into account the presence of the Seventh Fleet in their maritime domain. And of course, this is a term that was formulated by the late Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the United States as an honest broker, because it does not have any territorial disputes in any country in the region, primarily because it's an external power. But at the same time, it should harness its allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, in assisting the US. The United States is projecting its forward deployed forces in the Indo-Pacific region, assuring them that you can rely on the United States to basically ensure stability in a region that is marked by security uncertainties triggered by the emergence of China. The US should encourage its allies to strengthen the respective security relations with the Southeast Asian countries, especially in the realm of maritime domain awareness, capability building of their navies and Coast Guard. The US should actively support the Southeast Asian countries' capabilities in recognizing and resisting Chinese gray zone operation in the South China Sea. We can discuss this later. What is a gray zone operation? And of course, how China is using this in the South China Sea. So overall, ASEAN-China relations. Most ASEAN respondents are aware that the Belt and Road Initiative is the key feature of ASEAN-China relation. ASEAN respondents are, of course, divided in their responses to the following survey question. China treats ASEAN as co-equal. China respects ASEAN centrality. China respects national unity, sovereignty, territorial integrity of ASEAN states. China proactively tries to diffuse geographic rivalry and tension in the region. So in a way, this might reflect the division within ASEAN regarding how we look at China, or it could also reflect wariness regarding whether China is, it might be a good economic partner, but when it comes to diplomatic and security issues, that's where the concern and the wariness come in. Some countries in Asia accept their government as simply too close for comfort to China. Probably one of them was the Philippines, especially during the time of the former president, Duterte. A considerable number of respondents believe that ASEAN must have a balanced approach to cooperate with both great powers, China and the United States. Interesting. Yeah. So for them, a considerable number of respondents also believe, and this is interesting, that the US-China competition is good for the ASEAN member states. So for them, this is not a challenge to the rule-based international order. This is, in a way, something that benefits the region. And we can discuss this later. A positive view regarding the competition. This reflects many respondents are conscious of ASEAN's traditional diplomatic gains in dealing with great powers. Either equidistancing, you try to distance, or later on we could discuss what is equibalancing. So what is to be done? The US and its ally must maintain both substantive and symbolic presence in ASEAN events. President Joe Biden indicated that he'll be attending the summit in Cambodia, in contrast, of course, to his predecessor, who did not attend ASEAN summits 3 times. I will not have to mention his name. He might make a comeback sooner than later to show that they are not weak, disinterested, and unreliable great powers in the region. So specific issues in China-ASEAN relations. The respondents are split in their opinions on the formation of Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Australia, United States, United Kingdom Security Partnership, AUKUS, and of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's growing presence in the Pacific. So this might again reflect the division within ASEAN as shown, I think that this was last year after AUKUS was formed. You have Malaysia and Indonesia expressing wariness, while Singapore and the Philippines said, this is a positive development again. So respondents are divided or had no opinion on whether these minilaterals would undermine or threaten ASEAN centrality. So this is also an interesting point. There's no consensus whether they represent a threat to ASEAN centrality. The majority of the respondents view the management of the South China Sea and Mekong River dispute between ASEAN and China as not properly handled. And of course, there's a view that it's because of China. What is to be done? The US should engage in development of minilaterals and facilitate NATO's growing presence in the light of ASEAN's lack of common position regarding these developments. In fact, 20% of the respondents gave the opinion that Quad is actually strengthening regional stability. The US and its ally must pursue specific initiative in the South China Sea and Mekong River disputes that will enable them to constructively influence the contention and project themselves as responsible stakeholder. Now I'm going to my conclusion. So what's a general recommendations? Okay, ASEAN is not new in dealing with great power competition. It was created in 1967 as a reaction of then small powers in the light of the Vietnam War and of course the Cold War. ASEAN has relied either on equidistancing or equibalancing in interacting with the major powers, especially of course when they are in a state of competition. Washington and its allies should impress upon ASEAN that their presence in Southeast Asia is aimed to ensure that the regional states can continue to play its game in the face of China's goal of rejuvenation of great Chinese nation and fostering a common destiny with the Southeast Asian states, which is actually euphemism for Chinese hegemony in Southeast Asia. China considers the region as its backyard, and China would continue to treat the region as, of course, its Levenstrom or living space. Continuously explain to ASEAN that the US grand strategy of a free and open Indo-Pacific is not detrimental to ASEAN centrality, as it will enable the member states to continue playing their diplomatic games of either equibalancing or equidistancing in the face of great power competitions. Engage ASEAN in an open and candid discourse on how its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy can converge with ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, a discourse, especially with the key proponent of the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, the primus inter pares within ASEAN, and that's of course Indonesia. Maintain and possibly enhance American presence in ASEAN annual rituals, which I think President Biden would do this November. Assure ASEAN that the US will not force its member to make a choice between Washington and Beijing, since its competition with China actually provides Southeast Asian states the opportunity to play its age-old diplomatic games. And finally, this is just fostering cooperation. This is the last slide. I know I might be harness US allies in enhancing America's role as Southeast Asia's honest broker and strategic offshore balancer. So I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador, please unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Great. So thank you very much, Renato. I think that you've really given us some great points to consider. So let's just jump right to the next presentation. And then when we get to the end of all the presentations, I'll give my thoughts on a summary or some questions to explore further. So next up is Dr. Koo Ing-hoi. Ing-hoi, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dan. Thank you for inviting me, the consortium of researchers, this panel on reinvigorating the US partnership in the Indo-Pacific. So I don't have the PowerPoint to share, but what I'm going to do in this presentation is that I will first provide a broad overview. So when it comes to the situations in Southeast Asia, when it is related to the US and China, and then I will zoom down to the Malaysia case, specifically looking at Malaysia and the Indo-Pacific, how we perceive the Indo-Pacific concept in Malaysia. And I will then move on to the three questions by regarding the US partnership in a broader view. So, as we all know, the debate on the implications of the ASEAN in the evolving power rivalry never stop, as the US-China strategic competition intensify in the region. The debate on ASEAN centrality at the same time also gained momentum with increased attention on the role of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. So what it is interesting is that it further raises questions about the regional bloc standpoint when it comes to Indo-Pacific. And Southeast Asia has been a battlefield for the discussion on Indo-Pacific, where this term is continues to be contested and political for some of the countries. Some other countries in the ASEAN are more open about that, for example, in Indonesia. But some countries, especially, for instance, in Malaysia, that I'm going to zoom down later, has been quite silent, or rather not too vocal when it comes to this narrative of Indo-Pacific. So I think generally the region's identity has been on the broader concept of Asia-Pacific for decades. For some, the term of Indo-Pacific somehow signals a United States-led strategy to counter China's growing rise. So generally, most of the ASEAN member states is determined that it does not wish to choose a side. I think this is being shown in many of the surveys that are trying to explore into how Southeast Asians actually perceive in these two great powers rivalries. I think just now Prof. Renato was mentioning about the FPCI, ASEAN-China survey 2022 that has just been launched and being shared and presented. And that result of the surveys quite resonate together with another surveys that is in the state of Southeast Asia 2022 conducted by the ASEAN Studies Center at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. So what's interesting that over the years, China, despite of all the other narratives of it can be more aggressive, but China continues to be recognized as the most influential economic power, as well as the strategic and political power in the region. This itself, I think, is very important to take notes when we talk about the narratives on the Indo-Pacifics, because there is a reality on the ground here. But very interesting is that the in the State of Southeast Asia 2022 survey, the most trusted external power is Japan. Yeah, so those are the things that I think when I go down to how do we look at US-ASEAN partnership and what should be done and what maybe should be avoided, something that we perhaps discuss further. So we'll zoom down to the Malaysia's case, why Malaysia's hesitant on the stance on Indo-Pacific. So broadly, in the Malaysian context, we have had several documents coming from the Ministry of Defense as well as the Ministries of Foreign Affairs. So thus far that I see these official documents such as the 2019 Foreign Policy Framework of the New Malaysia, Change in Continuity, the 2019 Defense White Paper, and one of the latest is the 2021 paper from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Focus in Continuity, a framework for Malaysia's foreign policy in a post-pandemic world, notably do not at all explicitly mention the Indo-Pacific. Rather, the Asia-Pacific's continued use and one of the focus in Malaysia. Like most of the ASEAN member states, Malaysia view it as undesirable to endorse such a high-profile and perhaps could be contentious sort of position in the Indo-Pacific. Nevertheless, I think what Malaysia's positions here in the Indo-Pacific concept is more of looking towards the economic part, yeah, such as the Pacific Economic Framework. This is something that the government of Malaysia supported. For instance, during the virtual IPEF ministerial meetings hosted by the US in July 22, the Minister of International Trade and Industry, Muhammad Azmin Ali, or should I say the former, because we are going for the elections on the 19th November, that proposed that partners in the IPEF collaborate to set up a center of excellence to provide a structured platform to facilitate ideas among the members. And this sort of support towards the IPS continues. So that is on the economic part. But I would like to also bring the attentions toward the Asia-Pacific Roundtable. So Asia-Pacific Roundtable is being hosted by the ISIS Malaysia, in which they have been consistently organized annually. So during the 33rd Asia-Pacific Roundtable in 2019, the former ISIS Institute of Strategy and International Studies Malaysia chairman Tan Sri Rastam, in his welcoming remark, acknowledged that while the discussions on the Indo-Pacific is aggregating, however, in the view of ISIS, which is the think tank of Malaysia when it comes to international affairs and many other things, that there is no intention from the ISIS Malaysia to call this signature international conference as Indo-Pacific Roundtable, rather than maintain it as the Asia-Pacific Roundtable. And for this year, the 35th Asia-Pacific Roundtable, they do include one sessions on the that related to the Indo-Pacific concept, but they put it as the session as a resurgent Europe in Asia / Indo-Pacific. So they are using the perceptions from the Europeans looking at the Indo-Pacific that is being included in the agenda, but there's no further elaborations on the Malaysia stance when it comes to the concept of the Indo-Pacific. So that is basically the Malaysia side in this regard of the Pacific. And however, now I'm going to move on to, I need to also mention that what interesting is the comments by our Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, whom has been always very vocal when it comes to the issues of US versus China's power rivalries. For him, he doesn't think the Indo-Pacific economic framework is inherently beneficial, because he thinks that it is highly political to omit China. And for him, this is a wrong attitude, as it defeats the purpose of enhancing multilateral trade cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So that is his sentiment, whereby somehow he still has an extent of the influence when it comes to Malaysia's perceptions of international affairs. So what needs to be done to reinvigorate the US partnership in the Indo-Pacific? What can be done better, and how we should move forward? I would like to tackle these questions very briefly from the civil society's reaction. I think very often we talk about US-ASEAN partnership and looking at the state actors, how the ASEAN member states actually respond. But in fact, this kind of US-ASEAN partnership in using the Indo-Pacific has also impacted on how the civil societies that are working on democracy and human rights actually move. So one of the examples is the Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So while the state's reactions might be different, but on the ground from the civil societies, somehow it has its setback as well, because civil societies on human rights and democracy, they receive foreign assistance. So whom they receive the money from is something that becoming more sensitive, because that will be something that shows perhaps where are you more inclined. If you receive the money from the US side, or if you are using the money from the China side, because you're working on the issues that related to human rights and democracies. Basically, it kind of split the views into two, and it's difficult for some of them to actually mobilize. So Nancy Pelosi's visit is difficult for somehow, to some extent, for the civil societies working on democracies, and also try not to be threatened somehow by the external powers. So those are the things that I think has become somehow at a backlash for some of the civil societies working on all these issues. So while we're talking about this, the summit in the Cambodia, the ASEAN Civil Society Conference, or the ASEAN People's Forum, is also taking place at the same time at the ASEAN Summit, because this is always being done annually. So this time is in Phnom Penh, but of course Cambodia is very interesting when it comes to the issues of democracies and human rights. It's extremely highly contentious as well. So if you look at the agenda of this ASEAN Civil Society Conference, ASEAN People's Forum, that will be taking place actually today, 3rd to 5th November. Their title of the conference is Defending and Asserting Southeast Asian People's Civic Space, Democracy and Human Rights Towards Equitable and Just Society. But if you look at the agenda, one of the very apparent features is they're talking about alternative regionalism. So they're thinking on how to position themselves within this sort of a narrative when it comes to US versus China power rivalries. And another issues that they are also talking about is about social protections and many other things as well. So I think this is something that I would like to share. But my last point is normally whenever the civil societies have their ASEAN Civil Society Conference, they will also always try to get someone from the ASEAN to actually attend, to have a face-to-face in this session. So I think we have not seen that in but I'm not sure whether that will be happening. So, but that will be something that is also very interesting when we look at this sort of democracy and human rights narratives, where I think just now Prof. Renato somehow has shown that to a certain extent, there are many things that can actually backfire. So these democracy and human rights narratives at this point of time has becoming more challenging because of the great power rivalries, whereby in the past, I think when this great power rivalry is not as intensified as this, it has been actually helped a little bit more of the civil societies, but now it is a very challenging time for them to balance themselves and to actually continue to talk about democracy and human rights, because it is constantly being used as this is not something, it can be something that coming from the United States side and to counter China and many other things as well. So I will end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Yinghe. You gave us a lot to consider there about the civil society aspects of these issues. So next, I'd like to invite Wafa to give his perspectives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and allow me to share my screen. Wait, let me. Right. So thank you so much, Ambassador Shields. It's an honor for me to be among such a great panel. And I think as also an ASEAN speaker, I think I echo some of the sentiments that was told earlier by my colleagues as well, in sort of like the ASEAN sentiment towards the US and the whole great power competition as of today. So these are the outline of my presentation. So I echo some of the structures that was that was told earlier, and that I'll end with a sort of like a my reflections on the opportunities and challenges. So the current state of affairs, right? Great power competition dominates US return to the region in the Indo-Pacific era. So countries in Southeast Asia really feel this sort of US return opposed, because it was so good during the Obama era, during the narrative on pivot to Asia, during and embodying his gestures to the region. His visit were many, his attention was there during the sort of Obama era, and there was a bit of a vacuum during Trump's era. And Southeast Asians tend to view this as a sort of a retreat in US leadership in the region, which is also understandable at that time, because you know, domestic politics in the US, but US return to the Indo-Pacific with the Indo-Pacific strategy. They were all being seen as being too anti-China, right? As like what the other what Professor Renato and Dr. Yingwei also said. And Southeast Asia countries fear getting caught in their rivalry, in being used as battleground and being forced to choose. And Southeast Asians also react differently to US rebalancing campaigns, as notably can be seen among their reactions towards flagship initiatives like the Quad. And because some countries in Southeast Asia view them as positive, others view them as threatening, others are wary and anxious. And the rather coercive and norm-changing rise of China has risen concern from Southeast Asia, but different threat perceptions means different countries will react differently to US rebalancing efforts. So for instance, probably countries like Vietnam, probably also Philippines, they would welcome this sort of US rebalancing, but others might be more anxious about it. Like, of course, Cambodia, to an extent, Indonesia is a bit in the middle. But this, I think, relates to the threat perceptions against China's coercive behavior in South China Sea. And Southeast Asia, indeed, remains a good trajectory and in good trajectory and confidence, as reflected in the projection in economic growth this year and next year. We're doing relatively well amidst the Ukrainian war and food energy crisis, benefiting from the rising commodity price, and the expectation is there for Southeast Asia to grow. But the same positive outlook sadly cannot be said about ASEAN as an organization, right? Because there's a unity issue, there's a litmus test in the form of Myanmar, that of course US will also take into consideration, because because US is in the middle of seeking for reliable partners in the region. So engaging with ASEAN might not be the first thing in mind for US decision makers because of this reliability issues and the sense that it is not portraying unity at the moment. Right, so background, US in Southeast Asia. I don't want to repeat some of the things that we might know already, but Southeast Asia has always featured quite well in the US strategy. I think not just during the Indo-Pacific strategy moment, but also before, against communism and in the 2000s against terrorism. And ASEAN has always viewed as a US sort of position as a great partner, as a strong partner, but also at the same time wary about it being an external power that can interfere, can sort of put too much dominance in the region. But now there is a momentum because of the Indo-Pacific strategy, because of the sort of the means that the US is portraying to deter China in the Indo-Pacific. There is a potential that Southeast Asia can play a central part again, and so is, I think, ASEAN also is wary about the intensification of Chinese activity in the South China Sea. So the concern is there. We do share the concerns of some of the Western countries on China's artificial islands, on their coercive behaviors, but at the same time, as I'll talk about later, there's also things that requires ASEAN to be inclusive to China as well because of some conditions. Right. So when it comes to political security relations, there has been a lot of records between US and ASEAN, joint exercises and military political security engagement, officer exchange, maritime cooperation, counterterrorism. And of course, US is also a top large arms exporter for decades to Southeast Asia. and that's that, right? Because even for the next years, US will continue to be this sort of reliable military partner, at least in the political security relations. And in terms of economic relations, of course, the economic snapshot that US is featured strongly to ASEAN's economic relations. It is consistently among, if not the largest in certain years, source of foreign direct investments and second largest trading partner among ASEAN dialogue partners. So it's not that the US economic presence is small, right? But it's just that Chinese sort of return to or investment to ASEAN really dominates in certain areas. But modalities in economic relations between US and ASEAN is there. Social cultural. US conducted a lot of programs that empowers the vulnerable, investing in development funds, humanitarian assistance and disaster assistance, exchange in leadership programs, scholarships. US universities continue to be at the top of the mind in Southeast Asia, and of course, among one of the top donors in COVID-19 assistance to Southeast Asia, right? And this is the social cultural relations. In other fields of cooperation, US features well in science and tech cooperation, digital infrastructure, and clean energy projects. A lot of the sort of initiative from the US, they emphasize a lot on clean energy, on infrastructure, on sustainable financing, something that is less emphasized on some of the BRI-centered initiative and Chinese-centered initiative. Of course, but a lot of the implemented programs fare less favorably because there's not a lot of a big flagship program like BRI that everyone knows yet, and that is implemented among the countries. And of course, as my other ASEAN colleagues suggested, US presence in the ASEAN, of course, features a direct comparison with China, as China is among the largest source of FDI to ASEAN, hovering around fourth. And China features and have a great will have a great future trajectory because of RCEP, and economic integration is currently at the moment is being led by China. The issue, of course, with China is that there is a zero COVID policy, a flow of people, and barriers to diplomatic negotiations. So the code of conduct all stalled because of there is no intimacy in negotiations. We cannot interact with some of the Chinese scholars and decision makers and negotiators. Also, a bad sort of like bad points in terms of the possible escalation in the Taiwan issue. Of course, there is a worry about that in ASEAN meetings. The Taiwan issue features, although it's quite hard for us to express this concerns to the Chinese side as well. On the surface, there is of course also our worry is also because of there is a lack of leadership and inaction from the Chinese sides to solve or to do more in potential security crisis like North Korea, like the Ukraine war. They say less, at least publicly. So we don't really know what they're doing with Russia, or if they're trying to stop Russia in some ways in the private capacity, but publicly they don't say much. So that's also frustrating for us, especially those who feel that there is a threat in the current situation. So key points and takeaways, right? Before I go to my recommendations, US features as a strong provider of security umbrella in the political security realm, especially there is a myriad of security assistance and programs in the region involving the US, prove that Southeast Asia still see US as a valuable entity that could help guarantee a balance when faced with the China geopolitical ambition. But of course, China in itself, because of its geographic proximity, market size, industrial output, resource flow to the region, and strong commitment to infrastructure, we cannot just brush it away, because the great power is here to stay and stay for long. And it has indeed overtook US as the primary trading partner for the region in some aspects. And countries in the region strive to maintain economic growth and project legitimacy. And of course, US has a chance to feature in because of the IPEF, because of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, as an alternative to BRI. But of course, we still see how it will be implemented down the road. And beyond maintaining existing relations, I think probably US will need to get creative, because the US oftentimes, as we ASEAN countries see, US still needs to reaffirm its commitment to, of course, European, Middle Eastern allies, right? Despite the rhetoric of the Indo-Pacific primacy. So we also always see that the US will be distracted somewhere else. So I think going forward, the US will need to tailor its policy toolbox so that it can be more sensitive to the regional partners' needs, like what Professor Renato said at the beginning of our panel. So opportunities, again, I echo what Professor Renato said. US, if it wants to sort of improve relations with ASEAN, it needs to show that US is a trusted partner, beginning with presence in major forums, like what you said, Ambassador Shields, that Biden will come to ASEAN to attend the summits. It's a fantastic start. Consistency would be great as well, because of course ASEAN member states are worried about China's buildup. The concerns are shared about the militarization of disputed territories. The Philippines feel it very well, even though they have a good, I think, economic relations with China, but the concerns are always there. And I think US can also support Southeast Asia to slowly transition their military into a modern fighting force, so that military ties is always there for Southeast Asia. But again, US will also need to acknowledge somehow that ASEAN is unlikely to take back its position on China, because it's the largest trading partner. China is completely outpacing the US in terms of their investment in building infrastructure, and ASEAN states, of course, will require US to be that balanced, so that it will not be completely reliant and solely linked to China. Right, so trade agreements would do well with Southeast Asia, and there is got to be I think a chain of good effects when it comes to further engagement with ASEAN countries. US can also maintain initiatives in niche expertise, such as climate in sectors like climate, health, digital technology, community development. These niche expertise aside from military, and I think of course in the social cultural front, I think there is a lack. If I talk with colleagues in the US, there's a lack of probably ASEAN study centers, Southeast Asian study centers in the US. So I think it might be, it will be good if the US have those centers that they show that they actually want to understand Southeast Asia better, that the Southeast Asia features higher in their sort of priorities. And the challenges, of course, like I said, first is internal. Because for me, honestly, US need to come back and return its dignity as a champion of democracy, as a power of example in Southeast Asia, because it has been perceived as being in decline in terms of character and normative power. So a foreign policy that changes this perception is needed, right? Like during the Obama term, I think that was the model in Southeast Asia, a model. Externally, I think I call some of my colleagues' views that there is a gap between the operational code, between the Southeast Asian code and the US code. For Southeast Asia, the operational code right now is development, connectivity, survival, and health security. Less about human rights, unfortunately, less about freedom, less about good quality of public goods and transparency, more about the need for now, right? So this presents a challenge to US re-engagement with Southeast Asia because of the narrative between autocracy and democracy. And as I talk with colleagues from, officials from the UK, from the US, they always ask me why China is winning the appeals, despite the many issues, despite coercivity, despite unopenness. But the answer, I think, is a gap between the appeal. For me, US appeals with civil societies, appeals with scholars, but China appeals to the governments. China appeals to the elites. China fulfills what the Southeast Asian elites programs is. So they do well with the future, for example, Jokowi government. They sort of adapt well with the Jokowi government's priority programs. So it makes the Indonesian government feel good. It makes the Indonesian government able to maintain their face in the face of the people. So for me, at one point, sadly, it doesn't matter whether it's good vaccine or if the efficacy of the vaccine works. But Sinovac came fast, came in many numbers when people are dying in Southeast Asia. That's why China looks good right now because of that. A fast response and good relations. So China features well in the sort of government elite programs. And in addition, I think US framing on autocracy and democracy will be less popular, because we got to admit that ASEAN model of government is still diverse, still very illiberal in some ways. And there is I think I can agree that there is a democratic backsliding in some of the countries, because democracy is less popular as an operational code. And there is a sort of like a belief, not a belief, more like a sense that democracy or good values cannot feed or cure nor protect people from disasters, right? Infrastructure does, vaccines does, and so does the concerns right now, and it features well with the Southeast Asian governments. Right. So there's also other concerns like ASEAN centrality, potential for an inclusive ASEAN, or US that is an inclusive US that is not so anti-China. And of course, there are other issues outside from the US-China competition, like cyber disaster, climate change, that US can still feature, because it's not all about US-China, right? And there is that concerns. And I put here in the spotlight that I think AOIP and US Indo-Pacific strategy can have room for harmony. Right. And I said, like what Professor Renato says, and the opportunity to recover trust is, for me, start from diplomatic commitments, the number of high official visits, placement of senior officials, allocation of resources, increase of studies, because as you know, I think this is as of 2019, the number of total visits pales, the officials that came to the ASEAN instead of the ASEAN officials that came to the US, it pales in comparison in that sense. Yeah, so I think in terms of recommendation, Washington, I think, should demonstrate, I think, more willingness to cooperate under sort of ASEAN terms or whatever, or strategies, or harmonize. I know it's hard, probably it doesn't reflect some of the domestic sentiment in the US, but such are the ideals that ASEAN believes. So, and US can also close the gap between its rhetoric and approach, like IPEF on the one hand, and implementation and funding. And of course, to be successful in competing for influence with China, I think ASEAN centrality also, some of the emphasis will need to be maintained. So yeah, I think that's it for my presentation. We can continue later in the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Wafa. I'm hearing some recurring themes there about showing up and building trust. So, well, we're doing great in terms of time. So next up will be Stephen, if you can give your presentation. And then once we're done with that, we'll move to Q&A. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much to to our wonderful group of panelists. Really, I think they've said it all. However, I'm going to try and bring in a few different angles, and I'm perhaps the odd person out within this panel. I don't belong to an ASEAN country, and I'm not American. I'm Canadian, sitting in Tokyo and trying to understand the region from those perspectives. With that, I'd like to frame my discussion with basically on 4 particular pillars or areas. First is identifying priorities of the United States and ASEAN, and I think this is useful for looking at convergences and finding platforms for cooperation. Second is thinking about the realities within each region or each in the United States and ASEAN. And without identifying the realities, I think it's very difficult for us to build those platforms. Third, I'd like to touch upon tools and recommendations that I think might be useful for building cooperation. And then lastly, I'd like to end with perhaps being provocative, talking about some of the challenges that I think exist in both the United States and ASEAN for building a relationship moving forward. So with that, how can we understand the priorities of the United States and ASEAN within the region, and where do they overlap? And I think it's really critical for us to be thinking about ASEAN in terms of its long-term aspirations. The reason why it's an association of Southeast Asian studies rather than a union or an alliance really was to deal with great power competition. And it has an enduring interest of building strategic autonomy within the context of being surrounded by much bigger powers. Today, that is with the United States and China, but in the past, that was, of course, the big economies of China, Japan, the United States, and others. This has not changed. I do think that the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook reflects the view that ASEAN needs to be central to how the region evolves, how the region how the competition between great powers continues to stress the region, and how ASEAN feels that the association's structure really is critical for building strategic autonomy, but also getting the benefits from all the countries within the region. This is very different than I think the United States. And as we look at the United States and in how it looks at the region, I think that, of course, it's interested in maintaining a US primacy. I think that it is very much interested in ensuring that China does not shape the rules of trade, technology, and governing structures. Now, we can talk about this in many ways. In terms of shaping the Indo-Pacific region, of course, we see the Belt Road Initiative as creating dependent economic relationships with neighboring partners. I think the United States understands this, and the United States is not alone with this observation that these dependent relationships means that whether it's Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, or other countries in ASEAN, will find it more difficult to make independent decisions when it comes to issues that are related to China. And I think that this is an area that the United States is firmly interested in shifting. In terms of trade, of course, the United States is interested in shaping the trade rules of the region, although it hasn't exhibited the leadership that I think it needs. In terms of technology, I think there's a growing understanding, and we've seen this just with the recent adoption of the CHIPS Act and limiting the rules of semiconductors within the region, that there's a clear understanding that who wins the race of technology moving forward is fundamentally going to shape not only technology, not only AI, not only quantum computing, but perhaps the relationship between governments and citizens. And this is really, really critical for how we think about competition within the region. So technology is an important area that I think the United States is looking at the region and trying to get buy-in. I mentioned governing structures. I think that the most recent national security document that was released by the administration has made significant progress in highlighting that democracy is not at the center of the United States policies within the Indo-Pacific, that they're interested in working with non-like-minded countries or countries that are interested in governance. And I think this is a positive pivot by the United States to move away from a democracy or a value-oriented approach to engagement within the region and focusing on ideas of good governance. And good governance is different than democratic promotion. And I think that in a region that's so heterogeneous as ASEAN, this is an approach that has more buy-in. So again, I think this identifying priorities helps us shape the discussion moving forward. What about the realities? And all of my colleagues on the panel today have addressed this, but I think ASEAN, because of trade relations with China, as well as its geographic position, really doesn't have a choice. It needs to engage in China. China has been a pivotal partner in ASEAN's development, whether it was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which China kept its markets open so ASEAN could pull its people out of poverty, whether it's exporting today or as Dr. Charisma mentioned, the Sinovac provision. All of this has been really critical in building some stability in the relationship, and this will not change. It will continue to deepen, and this suggests that this is an area that the United States needs to invest many more resources. The US, on the other hand, really has to play a global game. Part of that global game is dealing with authoritarian states like China and like Russia. But I think increasingly, the United States needs to think about the realities of the stakeholders within the region. And that goes back to my point about strategic autonomy is the priority of ASEAN. Development is the priority of ASEAN. As Dr. Charisma mentioned, this idea that it's not democracy that helps against pandemics and that really fosters development. It's this idea of good governance. And I think he missed that point, but I think good governance is a really critical part rather than this authoritarian democracy divide. What about the tools, or where can we think about in terms of the platforms for reinvigorating US-ASEAN relations? Here, I think that there's at least 5 or 6 different areas that we can be thinking about. Most importantly is trade. Let me say trade, and let me say trade again. The United States is not part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It withdrew from the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's put on the table the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is a good appetizer, but it's sure not going to fill the belly of ASEAN countries that are interested in filling their belly like through substantial trade agreements. And here, I think that there's really an opportunity for the United States to think about trade in a different way. I think the expression that's often used is that the United States is not a trade deal joiner, it's a trade deal maker. And with that, it's going to need to put on the table perhaps a TPP 2.0. Perhaps it will have to work with partners like Japan to advocate for the expansion of the current comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership to include countries like Thailand, South Korea, perhaps the Philippines. And by advocating for more trade, the United States doesn't necessarily have to be a direct trade player, but it can support other countries that are expanding trade within the region. And that speaks to, I think, Professor De Castro's point about using other countries like Korea, like Japan, perhaps the EU as partners to work in the region, to provide framework, to provide development structures, to enhance trade in a way that the current political environment in the United States doesn't support. So we can use partners to achieve our objectives and the US objectives. And I think that this is not just a US objective. I think Japan, South Korea, the EU would welcome these initiatives. And most importantly, ASEAN would welcome this initiative. So we don't necessarily have to work directly with ASEAN to strengthen US-ASEAN relationships. We can build strong partners and have our close allies like Japan, South Korea, etc., engage with ASEAN as a surrogate in many ways to achieve the objectives that I think both ASEAN and the United States would like to achieve. I think we haven't mentioned the quadrilateral security dialogue as much. I think that the quadrilateral security dialogue continues to evolve. If we look back to 2017, it was a primary security focused discussion. Today, we see at the summits that have been held and in documents that we've really migrated towards the provision of public goods in the region through technology cooperation, advocating infrastructure connectivity, talking about vaccine provision. These are really, I think, welcome developments in ASEAN because they're the kinds of initiatives that the ASEAN countries want. And if the United States, again, can supply these initiatives through the Quad, again, not working directly, but perhaps through minilateral agreements like the Quad, this is a welcome initiative. And again, it's useful in building a platform for reinvigorating the relationship between the United States and ASEAN. And here, again, I think we can think about development initiatives, infrastructure connectivity initiatives, technology initiatives, vaccine initiatives, health infrastructure. These are all welcome. And I think that whether we use the minilateral or the United States decides to work directly with ASEAN, these are all critical areas that I think can provide a platform for reinvigorating the relationship. The IPEF is an interesting agreement. It's interesting because it's a bit of a buffet. You take what you want of the IPEF agreement. And I think that this is somewhat of an attractive model for engaging with ASEAN. They don't have to take the whole agreement. They can choose the dishes that they'd like to take. And I keep going back to food analogies because if you've been to Southeast Asia, they're big on food. And I think this is a great way to be thinking about how we can build partnerships within ASEAN. It shouldn't be a zero-sum relationship. It shouldn't be about you take this or leave it. Rather, what are the opportunities for cooperation, and can we build several formula for engagement within the region? IPEF provides a good format. I think the next step for IPEF to strengthen US-ASEAN relations is to deliver some real resources to the IPEF. And this could be perhaps founding a secretariat in ASEAN that focuses on IPEF and the deliverables that it would like to bring to the region. It could focus on building think tanks that specifically focus on IPEF and how ASEAN-US relationships can continue to strengthen within the region. I think IPEF needs an educational aspect, an educational pillar as well, in which we can start to get more ASEAN awareness in the United States and broadly of the needs within the region and how they may fit within the IPEF structure. Maritime security is also a critical area. And here I think there's a couple different ways we can think about maritime security cooperation between the United States and ASEAN. Maintaining sea lanes of communication stability and good governance is a priority for all the countries within the region. I use these specific terms, good governance and stability, because their priorities are very much about ensuring that these areas are stable. With about $5.5 trillion of imports and exports and energy resources going in and out of the South China Sea in particular, but also through the East China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. This is a global public good, and working with ASEAN to highlight the global public nature of stable sea lines of communication is something that we need to continue to promote. And here, I go back to my point that I think that the US, reinvigorating the US-ASEAN relationship should include other partners like Japan, Australia, the EU. And yes, we need to find opportunities for China to engage in that process. And this, we'll need to think of creatively about how non-traditional security cooperation, the areas of anti-piracy, illegal fishing, mitigating climate change could be a potential area for strengthening that relationship and moving away from a non-zero-sum approach to China, but also, again, finding opportunities to reinvigorate the relationship with ASEAN. Professor Cruz de Castro talked about gray zone operations, but I think we should also mention lawfare operations. And it goes back to my comment about education as being a critical area of cooperation between the United States and ASEAN. The ASEAN states need to be aware of not only the gray zone operations and aspects of Chinese salami slicing tactics, but also to find creative tools to use legal structures to push back against, I think, growing expansionism of China within the region. And this means educational cooperation in the particular area of law. And we've seen how important that is. The Philippines in 2016, with their successful case at the Permanent Court of Arbitrations, speaks to the Philippines' deep engagement in the United States legal system and their training, which enabled them to use international law to achieve their objectives. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brunei are not in the same space. And this may be an opportunity for the United States and ASEAN to invigorate their cooperation using a pillar that's not controversial: education. Supply chain resilience is another area that I think we can continue to cooperate with. Here, I think that the United States still needs to work with other partners. Japan is embedded in the region, has an important place within the region's political economy. It's already invested significant resources in selectively diversifying supply chains and investing in resilience within the region. And here, I think that the United States and ASEAN could benefit from cooperating with countries like Japan to strengthen supply chain resilience and build some economic diversity into the economic portfolio that ASEAN countries have. Critical to this will be enhancing intra-ASEAN integration. Intra-ASEAN integration through building infrastructure connectivity, to helping build rules for ASEAN to have more economic exchanges with themselves. This is important in building and strengthening strategic autonomy so ASEAN can function as a single unit to make more ASEAN-centered decisions on issues that are important for ASEAN, such as a code of conduct in the South China Sea. Lastly is development. And I think when we're thinking about development, we often think about the United States helping ASEAN develop. But I think ASEAN themselves need to think about how they need to strengthen the development of their own members. And here I'm thinking specifically about Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, who are the laggards in terms of development within the region, making them susceptible to influence from third parties, fracturing ASEAN unity. So the United States can help with this process. I think, again, good partners like Japan are prescient of this challenge, and they continue to invest in intra-ASEAN integration to make it a more reliable strategic partner, but a partner that has strong strategic autonomy moving forward. Lastly, can I be provocative? And I think we should be provocative. And I think Dr. Charisma mentioned this, that ASEAN has its own problems and ASEAN needs to put its house in order. And there's a couple members within that house that are not exactly reliable partners. You mentioned Myanmar. There needs to find a way to move forward on the Myanmar issue. Laos and Cambodia are also somewhat of a problem in terms of being the weak links in ASEAN unity. And here, I think this goes back to my point about how we can help these countries be more reliable partners with ASEAN so that they can realize ASEAN's aspirations of consensus-based decision-making, development, and deepening strategic autonomy. Here, there's a lot of work to be done. More dialogue is important, but I think the leading members of ASEAN need to work with outside partners like the United States and others to enhance those countries' abilities to be less susceptible to third countries, in this case, China, fracturing ASEAN unity. Lastly, and it's important to focus on the United States. It's not only ASEAN that's worried about the United States and the direction, its political unity, and its over-securitized approach to the region and its Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada is worried about this, Japan is worried about this, and others as well. We need to continue to send the message to the United States that while we appreciate their security footprint and their security commitments to the region, that the region doesn't have a zero-sum approach to how it engages with big countries like China. We need to find opportunities and platforms for cooperation in many realms. Again, development, supply chain resilience, maritime security, non-traditional security, education. And these are going to be critical areas to building and reinvigorating the US-ASEAN relationship. And we need to continue to send those messages to Washington, but also be creative in finding ways for Washington to engage in the region. And again, this goes back to, I think, some of the challenges of ASEAN itself. It wants to be central. It wants to continue to be an important partner within the region, but it also has to put on the table real initiatives for the United States to engage within the region. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. And again, I learned a lot from everyone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thanks to all the panelists. So what we will do is in a moment, Manasa has agreed kindly to sort of bring together the questions that have come in through the chat channel. And so, so if you can pull that together a bit, Manasa, appreciate that. And let me just take a moment to, I think summarize is maybe too ambitious a term, but to try to identify a few of the salient points that struck me from the very rich presentations from the panelists. So one of the things that struck me with regard to Renato's presentation was his message about the US needs to listen. And certainly I've seen that back when I was practicing as a US diplomat, and I think it remains every bit as true now as it was then. As you recall, Renato also highlighted this ASEAN-China survey, and some of the points that came out of that about the relatively positive economic perceptions within ASEAN of China, but concerns about negative externalities. And then on the political and security side, I think a lack of trust in China. And of course, this trust issue has come up again and again in many contexts, whether it's lack of trust toward China, lack of trust toward the United States. I think the trust issue is quite fundamental. So those are some of the things that really caught my eye from Renato's presentation. With Ying Hui, I thought what she made us focus on was the critical role of civil society. And as Yindu mentioned in the initial presentation, I spent a fair amount of time at the Army War College, and I was just down at the Air Command and Staff College, and we often use that DIME framework, diplomacy, information, military, economic. But I feel that, you know, it's always useful, of course, to have some shorthand. But one of the points that really gets pushed to the side when you frame issues in the DIME terms is the civil society role. And so I think certainly in the discussion going forward, what I hope we can do is come back a bit more to that question of the civil society dimension of the US-ASEAN relationship. As I saw when I was the charge at US-ASEAN in Jakarta in 2017, which happened to be the last time we had a US president who actually went out to a summit. But I worked a lot with young Southeast Asian leaders, leadership initiative, YSEALI. And anybody who's worked with an organization like that sees the incredible dynamism of civil society in the region. So I think figuring out how we can harness that in this effort to rejuvenate US-ASEAN relations. With regard to Wafa's comments, I thought he gave us a really great overview in terms of the way that ASEAN is navigating between the United States and China in this great power competition. And I thought a point that you made that struck me, Wafa, was this idea that great power competition is certainly nothing alien to ASEAN, that it has its roots, and I think Renato made this point as well, it has its roots from the very beginning of ASEAN. And I think even if you look at the longer sweep of Southeast Asian history, you see the Southeast Asian nations balancing among these great powers. And it is interesting to look at the upsides of this. And this came up in Renato's presentations as well, but ASEAN's good at this, right? Figuring out how to navigate between great powers. So it really does create some opportunities for ASEAN, which I'm sure that ASEAN leaders will figure out how to take advantage of. Obviously, keeping it within reasonable constraints. If the great power competition gets too intense, I don't think that's good for ASEAN or for anyone. And another point that struck me from Wafa's presentation was this point about the Myanmar issue. I think any serious effort by us to address rejuvenating US-ASEAN relations will really have to come to grips with what's going to happen in Myanmar. And I know the regime has talked a bit about elections and maybe in 2023, but whether that really happens or not, and whether if there are elections, there can be any kind of a credible process, I think will be very important issues to pursue. And then Stephen bringing us home with his presentation on the four pillars of the relationship, and this question of how, beginning with the aspirations, right, that the two sides have, and I think I like Stephen's remarks about how the U.S. looks at it, that the U.S. is seeking to preserve primacy, and that it does not want China to set the rules, but that it's a different kind of a competition than we're used to. And I like the emphasis on the importance of technological competition. Some of the other points that really resonated for me in Stephen's presentation was his focus on IPEF and energy issues and supply chains. I really feel that this question of how the United States and ASEAN can collaborate to ensure secure energy supplies and secure supply chains for the United States, ASEAN, and for the world, I think are critical. And I was also quite struck by Stephen's point about the lawfare issues and the legal issues. To be honest, I was initially skeptical about how much this mattered in the region, particularly in relation to China. But I've certainly come around from doing what's been advised and listening to friends in the region. And what I'm hearing from friends from Vietnam and elsewhere is that China really cares, how they're perceived on these legal issues, including UNCLOS issues. So I think this focus on education and particularly on legal education, I think is a very promising area for cooperation. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Manasa, if you can flag some of the questions that may have come in through the chat channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shields, and thank you everyone for the great presentation. So our first question is from Stephen, which is, where does the EU fit within the context of strengthening the US-ASEAN partnership? I believe this was for Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro, if I'm not wrong. Or maybe
yeah, sure. Again, this is my point. Yeah, we have to accept the reality that China is an economic actor here. It's our neighbor, but it's not inevitable that our economy should be tied to China alone. Again, I feel that's, shiver every time I hear the Chinese shared economic destiny. Scares the hell out of me. So my take here is, of course, diversification. We need not tie our economies only to one national economy. That's where, of course, the EU, Japan, South Korea, even Canada, the economies comes in. The key word for ASEAN to maintain its strategic and diplomatic space is to look at diversity, not simply accepting what has been considered as inevitable. A common economic destiny with China. That's my take.
If I may jump in to these questions from the civil society's reactions towards it, looking at the foreign assistance or foreign aids that they receive. In fact, with this US versus China's rivalries that's going on in the regions, it has also opened up for opportunities for the European countries to actually offer more assistance to the civil societies here in the regions. And for examples, a few countries like Germany and so forth, they have been extremely active in these regions in offering assistance and development aids and many other ways in terms of organizing events, programs, activities, awareness on the democracy and human rights. And the difference is that the narratives that they use are not extremely strong, and very often they leave it to the program owners to actually see what are the things that they think it is doable in the local context. So those are the things that are ongoing here in the region, which is quite significant at this point of time. Thank you.
I'll jump in a bit as well because of on the EU stuff. I think the survey from ICS that Dr. Ying Hui mentioned as well, I think mentioned that aside from Japan, for ASEAN, the preferred partner when it comes to diversifying between US and China is the EU. So EU features highly as a trusted partner aside from Japan. I think India as well, but EU features and Japan relatively quite high. And I think EU can be that partner that provides, a partner that is to fall back into amidst this great power competition. And I think EU is also the largest contributor to ASEAN COVID response fund. And I think it's very underrated that this data. I think even in the beginning, when Chinese contribution to this recovery fund, it was around 6 million. I think at that time, EU funding was already 300 million something. And I think in accumulation, it was at least 800 million right now. So there's a big contribution in terms of in fighting coronavirus to assist ASEAN in that capacity, but it's less pronounced in diplomatic sense. So probably people don't see it. A lot of the layperson didn't see that the EU actually supported ASEAN countries in this time of plight, but I think the packaging also matters, right? Because EU right now is being seen as as having its own issue in Europe and sort of distracted in a way. Of course, it's a very important issue in Ukraine, but ASEAN countries see that EU might have to I think concentrate on its own problem for now. So it might have less ability to project outside the region with the energy crisis, and next year probably a colder year for Europe.
Thank you, Stephen. You have your. Oh, sorry, Ambassador Shields. Go
No,
ahead.
that's okay. Go ahead, Manasa. Yes.
Just a couple of points. I think that it goes back to my point about ASEAN clearly articulating the kinds of needs that it has with for extra-regional partners, and I think this will continue to be an important aspect of how ASEAN deals with some of its issues in terms of securing strategic autonomy. Of course, it can reach out to the United States, but I think that other partners are important as well, and it needs to clearly articulate what it needs. I mentioned the EU, and I think the EU is a really interesting partner. They have an Indo-Pacific strategy right now, but I think that we can also think about particular countries and what they can bring to the region in terms of resources. And I think that the resources can be, again, education. It can be good governance training. It could be that helping with health infrastructure. These are all really important ways to reinvigorate not only US-ASEAN relationships, but ASEAN-EU relationships. And I think we need to be more creative about how we think about building those relationships. And I don't think it's just the EU. Any extra-regional partner needs to be doing the same thing. What can they actually bring to the region that will help the region? But what does the region need? And again, I think this is really important. ASEAN can't just be a taker. It has to be a giver. And at this stage, I think that it needs to ASEAN, if it wants to have a stronger relationship with the United States and outside partners, it has to rebrand itself and start to talk about what it brings to the table, not just what it, not just be a taker in terms of relationships.
Renato, do you have a comment? Yes, please.
I have a question directed to Ying. I agree with you that the US-China strategic competition poised as a threat to civil society movement. But what about the third term of President Xi Jinping? His efforts to basically consolidate the Communist Party and adopt, of course, a policy of really Maoist Stalinist approach in China, where, of course, democratization is really, off the table, and of course, simply antagonistic towards any semblance of civil society in China.
Yeah, actually, there are also a group of civil societies that working on countering the narratives of China. However, this group of civil societies do not publicly voice out their views because of the risks that might come to them. Hence, these are the things that are being done, and sometimes it's not being done in the region too, because it imposes quite a high risk to some of the activists who actually voice out, because it really depends on where are these activists located, especially if they are in the countries that their countries basically have a very clear line between the US inclinations or the China. Those are the things that actually can be quite dangerous for them. But what I would like to clarify is that it is not to say the civil society do not wish to counter the narratives or when it comes to authoritarianisms and many other things, but just it has to be done in a different way. But on the other hand, that opens up to a bigger challenge, that is because of the narratives of democracy and human rights is not something that that can be well received in all of the ASEAN countries. There are some countries that are more open to the concept, but in the countries such as if I use Malaysia, if you keep talking about human rights, they're gonna come up to you and say, I need something about the bread and butter issues. Hence, the FPCI, the State of Southeast Asian survey has shown that the human rights is not something that the people are actually focusing on. So there is a need to change the narratives of, to mellow down in stop saying that the human rights is the main issue. Of course, I think it is very important, but it really backfires because the civil society couldn't use the same narratives to actually tell the people this is important because they don't see it. So yeah, those are the challenges.
Great. Okay, Manasa, any other questions that came in the chat?
Yeah, there was one final question and a lot of raised hands, but one question from the chat is from Lynn Ha to Dr. Yinghui, which is they have a question about US's interpretation of ASEAN centrality. At the US-ASEAN Special Summit, President Biden emphasized US support for ASEAN centrality. However, in its launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the US did not invite ASEAN member states that are considered to have a very high relationship with China, including Cambodia, which is the ASEAN chair this year. With the exclusion of some ASEAN members, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, would the US be able to create a strategy independent of China?
And
Yeah.
Manasa, is that directed to a particular panelist?
Yeah,
And
it's
it's
Dr. Ying Hui.
I guess it's to everyone, like is particularly, I mean, as the question goes to, like anyone can jump in, is okay. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much of to offer in these questions, but I think in the region itself, there are countries. Well, I would like to move away from this by taking Timor-Leste into the picture, because Timor-Leste is trying to get into the ASEAN. Yet in this time, the Cambodia's chairmanship, they have not been able to do so, and we can see the current president, Jose Ramos Horta, has been actively going around, especially using the Indonesia's chairmanship later to finally put Timor-Leste into the admission. And in the region itself, it has been a lot of talk about how Timor-Leste's relations with China. And coming for the Timor-Leste governments, they have always keep this standpoint where they are friends with everyone. But despite of their very close relationship with China, but in some of the ASEAN member states, they have been using this of they are being too close with China, as one of the reasons that, you know, maybe they, and also you can see the interesting relationship between Cambodia and Timor-Leste in the regions. These are the extremely very clear things that, you know, how Cambodia has been offering a lot of assistance towards Timor-Leste, that within these great power rivalries, which is something extremely very interesting to actually look at. Somehow it also divides the ASEAN member states into two different blocks of, you know, some are very vocally towards China's and some are not as well.
Great, thank you. Stephen, I saw you had your hand up. Do you still have a comment?
I did. It reflected a little bit of the previous discussion about where human rights should sit in reinvigorating the US-ASEAN relationship. And I agree very much with Dr. Hui that this should not be the litmus test for how we reinvigorate the relationship. However, I think that we need to think about what are the different ways we can talk about these issues in a way that is more conducive to dialogue. And here, you know, again, often we think that the United States can lead. I think it often needs to look at how some of its partners are engaging in the same region and having a little bit more progress and success in dealing with their initiatives. A good example is Japan. I'm based in Japan, so I see a lot of things through Japan. When the former president of the Philippines came into power, Mr. Duterte, Mr. Abe didn't criticize his less than democratic approach to governance. He didn't criticize the drug crackdown. He went to Davos. He put on a Filipino shirt. He had some chicken adobo, and he built a relationship so that they could start to have dialogue about these issues in different ways. I think this is an approach that we need to think about more as Western countries, in particular the United States, of how it's engaging with regional leaders. And we can still address these issues, but we need to put them and address them in a different context. But I'd love to hear how Renato thinks about this. But on the IPEF issue, not including Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia, from my standpoint, I think that this is thoughtful. We're trying to create, the United States was trying to create an agreement that pursues standards, talks about standard building, starts to talk about cooperation in specific areas. And if you want to form a dialogue moving forward, you have to include in the group partners that are largely going to buy into these. Those three countries, I think, are commonly understood as client states of China. And as a result, I think they would be more obstructionist rather than constructionist in how we think about IPEF. That doesn't mean we don't leave the door open for future cooperation or some kind of associate membership. But if we're starting to build the rules through an IPEF agreement, then we need to bring like-minded countries. I didn't say governance systems, like-minded countries into into a constructive process of building rules that will hopefully shape the region.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Renato, did you want to pick up at all on the points that Stephen raised? No, okay. Oh, yes, Wafa.
Thank you, Daniel. I think with regards to the question from Lin Ha as well, I think Stephen mentioned this. I think it's important to support the intra-ASEAN integration that ASEAN can, so that ASEAN can appear as a strategic autonomous agency, and rather than so I think rather than the exclusionary initiatives, a lot of more inclusive multilateral support might be more appealing to this notion of for ASEAN. And ASEAN have a modality in ASEAN Charter, right? So ASEAN Charter is a modality that and I think this reflects as well to Stephen's and Ring Yingho's point on human rights value. I think I would have to disagree if the recommendation is about US stopping a focus on human rights at all, right? I think human rights continues to be very important, but the thing is, I think the issue would be leverage. So US leverage, the countries, the champions of democracies leverage, the Western leverage at the Southeast Asia currently is quite weak. For instance, Indonesia's transformation to a democracy is because of the military. The military in Indonesia is US educated military, is exposed to democracy in US, and then when they come back, they become a force of reform. So that's leverage. And in Myanmar as well, we cannot have any ASEAN's mission to Myanmar is weak because we don't have like an ASEAN leverage to Myanmar. The economy there is dominated by China. The military relation is with Russia. So we don't have a way in terms of leverage. And so I think US leverage to Southeast Asia is very much needed. And it also I think reflects to Stephen's point on your sort of notion, Stephen, on what ASEAN can contribute to the Western, to these other partners as well. And I agree with that. But at the moment, uniquely, there's a partner in terms of China who doesn't ask for that at all. China doesn't want anything from ASEAN. It just keeps on giving, and that's where the imbalance comes. They don't really demand anything from ASEAN, and that's also a scary part as well. And that's where the imbalance with the other partners comes, because China is becoming this power that keeps on giving in that sense. I'll stop there.
Yes, Renato.
This is where I have a strong disagreement with Japa. China wants something from us, a common destiny with China. Do you want it? I don't. That's it. Every time they say common destiny with China, that's what China wants from us. It basically wants our hearts and soul by sharing and making sure that whatever, we share, common destiny, that we have to deal with, China's authoritarian, totalitarian system, to making sure that our economies are controlled by China. If we challenge China, then China would choose economic interdependence against us, like what they did to Australia, what they did to Norway, what they did to Japan, several countries. And of course, also in terms of values. So I strongly disagree that China doesn't want anything from us.
Right. So allow me to revise that. Scholars like you and me knows that, right? And because of this long term, but our government, the thing is, our government see more of a short-term interaction with China. And at the moment, China is giving everything for Jokowi's proposal on electrical infrastructure development in Kalimantan, for example, right? So and in this sense, in the short-term sort of framework, right, China appears like this sort of benevolent that gives everything to Southeast Asia yet for now. But when it comes to interaction with the US, of course, there's always questions of what can ASEAN provides for the regional. Of course, in the long term, it's very dangerous. That's why for us, because we will keep being very dependent on China. And that's what China wants because of that common destiny notion that you mentioned. Agree, in the long term, it will be very dangerous for us because in that sense, we have no idea when that Australia-China type of interaction will come to us, to our doorstep as well. I agree completely with you.
We experienced it in 2012. and when we filed the case against China in 2013.
Right.
Yes. Well, one thing that I find surprising is I've been out of the region for a while, but being back in the U.S., here the perception of China has really changed a lot in the past couple of years in terms of this focus on economic slowdown and so on in China. But it's interesting because in our conversation, we focus a lot on the economic benefits of engagement with China and that aspect of it. But what about risks? Are there growing concerns about the risks of tying Southeast Asian economies to such a great extent to the Chinese economy? I'd just like to open that up.
Oh,
Maybe I'll start with this.
Go ahead, Stephen.
When we think about ASEAN's economies and we think about how it's developed over the past 60 years, the ethnic Chinese communities have been incredibly important in creating the and linking supply chains from China into Southeast Asia and back. And they played a critical role. And this critical role has fueled economic development within the region. So can we untie these? It's often used as the expression of a noodle bowl. Can we untie these relationships? I think it's very, very difficult. Can we advocate for more transparent governance? I'm focusing on and using these kinds of terms rather than democracy or rule of law. I'm focusing on these ideas of, can we enhance transparency in these relationships? Can we infuse new standards and bring in new actors into the region that can build stability and help ASEAN strengthen its strategic autonomy? And that means new trading partners. It means helping ASEAN build better governance systems. It means including ASEAN in other regional and global partnerships. If we can do that, I think that there's a possibility that we can reconfigure ASEAN's economic relationship with China to a more balanced degree. And I think that is what we're aiming for more balance. And I go back to my point about how we can do that, and that's strengthening intra-ASEAN integration. They need to trade more with themselves than when they trade with a bigger partner. And that means building infrastructure connectivity, helping with educational exchanges, creating a lingua franca in the region that everybody can study in the same language so they can communicate within the region. It means relaxing borders so people can work in each other's countries. There's a lot of things we can do to do that, but fundamentally, decoupling from the Chinese economy is not in their interest, and I don't think it's possible.
Renato, did you have a hand up?
Yes, again, when we talk about our economic interdependence with China, this is simply a case of uneven development. Some ASEAN countries are really dependent on China primarily because they're part of the supply chain. But I'm talking in the case of the Philippines. We are not in that supply chain. Our economy is based, the dynamism is primarily because of remittances from abroad. So, in the case of the Philippines, we can afford to antagonize China every now and then because we're not part of that supply chain. I don't know. I think Indonesia used to be in that same position, but I think it changed primarily because you allow a lot of Chinese public investments.
Very interesting. Well, it certainly reminds me of the visit by the Vietnamese leaders to China, and this whole focus on that very complex relationship between Vietnam. And I often think of that phrase, cooperate and struggle. And I think we can see that at play in the Vietnam-China relationship at this time. And perhaps all of us need to think about things more in those terms rather than some more simplistic sense of competition. Great. Well, at this point, I'd like to try to wrap up before the hour. It's been such a great discussion. But let me just go around and see if any of the panelists or you, Dr. Indo, have any final comments, and then let's wrap up. So Wafa, I think you're leading us off. Yes, please.
Right, just a bit, right? Because just to add on the discussion with regards to Chinese economy, yes, I think at the moment China is very appealing for our governments because China is more lenient on projects, more lenient on standards, and of course, I think at the moment, the demand for a transparent systems and standards for sustainable financing is slowly creeping in. Not yet, but I think in a down the road, this Chinese model of development will be less and less appealing for Southeast Asian countries, and I think that will happen when innovations is the key operational code in Southeast Asia. Private sector is big. When civil society is strong, there will be times when Southeast Asia reach that level, and I think this sort of like model of development in China might be less appealing to Southeast Asian. So I think that's my point.
Thank you. Yes, Stephen.
So I think this discussion has revolved around a linear projection of continued Chinese prosperity and growth. And I don't know if this is, my sense is that the Chinese economy is decelerating. Youth unemployment is at least 20%. The role of state-owned enterprises is increasing. Innovation is suspect as state-owned enterprises increase. As Renato mentioned, the Marxist-Leninist presence in the Chinese economy and Chinese society is deepening. The ASEAN countries and the United States should think about what if the economy does stagnate? Do they need to develop new partners? Do they need to already start the selective diversification so that they are better able to deal with the reality that today's China or tomorrow's China will not be as rich and prosperous and productive as it is yesterday or a week ago? And I think this is really, really important. Look at the Europeans and Russia. They have buyer's regret. And you may have buyer's regret if you continue to bet on an economy that is structurally decelerating, but also because of policy decisions moving in a non-positive direction. And in that sense, the reinvigoration of the US-ASEAN relationship is very much in the interest of dealing with the reality of a stagnating China.
All right, any other panelists want a last word? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And then Dr. Indu, I'll give you the last word, but I'm just very grateful to be included in this event. Dr. Indu.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel Shield. Thank you for this balanced analysis and insightful comments on each presentation. And I'm very thankful to all the panelists and for the wonderful presentation. And I am thinking I have another panel on discussion of the China's maritime expansionism and China's aggressive posture, China's Taiwan, and what ASEAN says about Taiwan, South China Sea disputes, and North Korean threat. So I guess we will repeat our discussion next, and I'm hoping that Manasa will bring another panel on non-traditional security issues, because she has been doing her research and the PhD dissertation and comparing United States, Australia, and India in non-traditional issues and the Indo-Pacific implications. So hoping for another more discussion here, and I would like to thank Renato, Stephen, Wafa, and Yinghui, and who attended this panel and who is going to watch a video recording when it will be available soon. So thank you very much, and good night or good morning. What should I say?
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Indu. Thank you, Ambassador Shields.
I hope to makan soon.
Right, yeah, breakfast.
Yes. After Stephen's remarks, I'm hungry. A lot of food analogy.
Breakfast.
Yeah, breakfast.
I'll have breakfast.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
I'll have
Bye.
Filipino breakfast. You remember Filipino breakfast, Dan?
Oh, I sure do.
Garlic
Yeah, they're
fried
great. I love
rice.
Filipino breakfast.
Garlic fried
Yes.
rice with the langonisa.
Oh, yes. And what's that fish?